Welcome everyone to our online event on the margins of the CWC Conference of States Parties. Whether you are joining from your home office or here in The Hague while attending CSP, we are very pleased that you have joined us. My name is Yasmin Balsi and I am one of two co-program directors for national implementation at VERTIC. Please note that this online event is being recorded, and if you have any questions, you can leave them in the chat box as your microphones and cameras are disabled. Our topic today is national implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, focusing on a particular phase of the implementation process, namely legislative analysis. You will hear from us at VERTIC about the tool that we have developed for this purpose, and from the Republic of Tajikistan regarding their experiences with analyzing their CWC implementing legislation. But first, our event today and the activities mentioned have received funding support from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I am therefore delighted to invite Mr. Bent Bakken to deliver opening remarks for this event. Mr. Bakken is Senior Advisor with the Section for Global Security and Disarmament of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is attending CSP in The Hague and will unfortunately have to leave after his opening remarks. But for now, Bent, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. And good afternoon or good morning or good evening to all of you in whichever time zone you may be in. I would like to thank the organizers for convening this meeting, and I would like to thank all of you for setting aside time to discuss these issues. The Chemical Weapons Convention is one of the pillars of the global disarmament and non-proliferation regime. It has a large scope, including an implementing organization, the OPCW, and a comprehensive verification regime. Norway is an active supporter of the convention and of the OPCW. In 2013, together with Denmark, we contributed vessels, personnel, and financing to the safe removal of chemical weapons from Syria. Today, we hold one of the 41 seats in the Executive Council of the OPCW. We underline our full confidence in the OPCW and its technical secretariat in the meetings of the convention, such as the one that is taking place here in The Hague right now, and in other relevant fora, such as the UN Security Council, where we also currently hold a seat. As you know, national implementation measures are described in Article VII of the Convention. I am grateful to all of you at VERTIC for the assistance that you provide to states wishing to strengthen national implementation of the Convention. The legislation survey template is truly an impressive tool. To my Tajik colleagues, I would also like to say thank you for the work that you're doing in this project. Strengthening national implementation of the CWC makes the world safer in at least two ways. First, it reduces the risk of chemical weapons ever being used, which is our common undertaking as states parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention. And second, more indirectly, it is a way to make use of and therefore to strengthen the multilateral rules-based order. Tajikistan and Norway may be far apart, but we certainly share an interest in a world governed by laws, not weapons. I thank you all for your attention, and I wish you an interesting and productive event. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your opening remarks, Bent. We are very grateful for Norway's support. Thomas, next slide, please. As for the rest of our agenda today, we will hear from my colleague Sonia Drobis, the other co-program director for national implementation, to speak on VERTIC's assistance for national implementation of the CWC. I will then continue by speaking more about legislative analysis and CWC implementation obligations, while my colleague Thomas Brown, legal officer at VERTIC, will show how the legislative analysis tool that we have developed at VERTIC works. And finally, we will hear from Mr. Bakhtiyor Barotov, head of the Scientific and Technical Services Department at the CBRN Safety and Security Agency of Tajikistan, with regard to their experience with analyzing their CWC implementing legislation. We will close our event with a Q&A. You can leave your questions in the chat box. So with that, I'd like to give the floor to Sonia.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, and hello, everyone. Thomas, could you please show the next slide? Thank you. So for those who don't know us, VERTIC is a non-profit organization based in the UK in London, and we work on the verification, implementation of, and compliance with international agreements and initiatives. We focus primarily on instruments for the non-proliferation of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, and the security of related materials. VERTIC's National Implementation Measures Program provides legislative assistance on the national legislative implementation of those instruments, including treaties, UN Security Council resolution, and related international guidance. We have experience working with states worldwide on the legislative implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention and UN Security Council Resolution 1540. But because our mandate and expertise are not limited to one instrument, we are able to combine legislative assistance for the implementation of multiple instruments, for example, through the drafting of legal measures for the implementation of both the Chemical Weapons and Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, which is something that certain states are interested in doing. We implement our activities in cooperation and/or coordination with international and regional partners, including UN entities. Under the project funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we currently have project-based capacity to work with states worldwide on the implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Thomas, next slide, please. So today, as Yasmin was saying, you will hear from 3 members of the NIM team, namely Yasmin, Legal Officer Thomas Brown, and myself. But the team also includes Susanna Kosheby, Associate Legal Officer. We all have advanced degrees in international law and a number of years of experience working on the CBR international and national legal frameworks. We are able to work with countries having different legal systems and speak a number of languages. Next slide, please. So let me now further explain what our legislative assistance consists of. It is developed around 3 main pillars. So first, awareness raising on the international obligations and their translation into national legal frameworks through the dissemination of tools, materials, and participation in relevant events. Second, we provide legislative analysis assistance, which Yasmin will further explain in a moment. And finally, we provide legislative drafting assistance to draft legislation, review draft legislation, and provide supporting documentation to assist with the adoption of legislation. We do so during in-person activities when circumstances allow, but we are also able to provide remote assistance through, for example, the conduct of hybrid workshops where national stakeholders meet in their countries and the VERTIC team joins remotely, but also through remote correspondence. We can provide our assistance cost-free, subject to project limits, and we can provide our assistance in multiple languages, as I was saying, and to both common and civil law countries. I will now hand it over to Yasmin to further explain our legislative analysis activities.
Yes, so as Sonia noted, legislative analysis is only one aspect of our legislative assistance and also only one part of the process for states to ensure their legislation implements the CWC. Conducting legislative analysis means going through your country's existing laws and regulations to see which measures for the CWC are already in place and which ones are missing. This is largely a desktop-based activity involving legal research, and the end product of doing this analysis is a document that shows the legislative gaps and which also formulates recommendations for filling those gaps. Next slide, please. To assist states with analyzing their legislation and regulations, we have developed a legislative analysis tool at VERTIC. which we call the legislation survey template. It contains 163 distinct national implementation measures across 7 categories. This tool takes a comprehensive approach to chemical weapons. So it includes the obligations of the CWC, but it also includes those in UN Security Council Resolution 1540 and other treaties, for example, those on terrorism. We have been using this template internally for years to develop country-specific legislation surveys for states, but with Norway's support, we've been able to update this template in 2020 and made it publicly available for the first time in 2021. It is currently only available in English, but more languages will follow. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the legislation survey template covers 163 distinct national implementation measures across 7 categories. These are based on Article VII of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which requires states parties to adopt the necessary measures to implement their obligations under the convention, in particular criminal legislation. But also Article VI, which requires states parties to adopt the necessary measures to ensure that toxic chemicals and their precursors are only developed, produced, acquired, retained, transferred, or used for purposes not prohibited by the convention. And as I said, the legislation survey template also takes into account other international obligations. For example, those in UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which in one of its decisions requires states to adopt and enforce appropriate, effective laws which prohibit any non-state actor to manufacture, acquire, possess, develop, transport, transfer, or use chemical weapons, as well as nuclear and biological weapons. Next slide, please. The national implementation measures regarding chemical weapons are categorized in our legislation survey template across 7 categories. And these are adopting definitions for key terms, establishing criminal offenses, penalties, criminalizing participation in offenses, and establishing jurisdiction over these offenses. Then adopting national control lists, including scheduled chemicals, as well as adopting related control measures, such as controlling international transfers. And finally, legislative enforcement measures, such as conducting or facilitating inspections. Next slide, please. All in all, the legislation survey template is therefore meant both as a tool to identify international obligations with regards to chemical weapons and, next slide, please, also a tool to review national legislation by using the identified international obligations. I will now hand over to my colleague Thomas Brown, who will take us through the legislation survey template with some examples.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. So now I'm going to provide a number of examples of what legislative analysis can look like in practice. So, and just this will help to explain how we use the survey tool when we're conducting legislative analysis. So over the next few slides, you will see a number of screenshots from the survey templates itself, and this should just help to demonstrate how the process works. So in the left-hand column on the screen, you should see that we've included measures to implement the Chemical Weapons Convention and related international instruments. As my colleague Yasmin said already, there are 163 distinct national implementation measures that we include in this survey template, and these fall into 7 different distinct categories. The person who is conducting the survey will analyze the states in question's laws and regulations that are relevant to implementation of the CWC and relevant international instruments, and then compare them against the implementation measures that are found in the left-hand column. In the right-hand column, we would include any implementation measures that we would find in a state's national legal framework. So I'm going to provide a practical example now. So section B of our survey template looks at offences and penalties related to the implementation of the CWC. So let's take, for example, the prohibition against the use of chemical weapons. Under Article 1B of the Chemical Weapons Convention, states parties undertake never to use chemical weapons. When this is taken in conjunction with Article 7.1 of the Convention, and also United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540, operative paragraph 2, states parties need to criminalize the use of chemical weapons and also implement necessary penalties. So we're going to use here the example of country A. Country A is states party to the Chemical Weapons Convention and has drafted a law on chemical weapons to implement the convention. Under Section 2 of the Law of Chemical Weapons, no person shall use a chemical weapon. However, it is not enough merely to prohibit the use of a chemical weapon. As I mentioned before, it is also important that there are necessary the relevant penalties in place. So we would also, when conducting a legislative analysis, include relevant penalties. Section C says that a person contravening this section is guilty of an offence and liable on conviction on indictment to imprisonment. Therefore, we can see that country A has implementing measures in place that relate to B8 in the survey template, which is criminalising the use of chemical weapons and appropriate penalties. Sometimes we would be unable to find a relevant implementing measure when we would be conducting legislative analysis. If that was the case, we would normally leave the box in the right-hand column blank. Also, sometimes when we're conducting legislative analysis, we would find measures that are similar to the implementation requirements of the convention or the treaties, but are not always exactly the same. If this was the case, we would normally put a footnote explaining a little bit more the difference between the convention and the implementation measures we found. Or sometimes we would also elaborate on this in the survey overview, which is something I'm going to talk about in more detail a little bit later. So to provide another example, Section F of our survey template looks at control measures for scheduled chemicals, unscheduled discrete organic chemicals, and dual-use chemical equipment, software and technology. So here we're looking at Schedule 1 chemicals, and F1 is looking for implementation measures for prior declaration or licensing of the acquisition, retention, and use of Schedule 1 chemicals. And the national authority needs to be able to prohibit or limit such activities. This measure is taken from Verification Annex Part 6 under the Chemical Weapons Convention and also Article 6. So here again, we're going to use the example of country B. Country B has implemented the Chemical Weapons Convention primarily through its Chemical Weapons Act. And Section 19 of this Act says that subject to Section 20, no person shall use a Schedule 1 chemical or precursor for a permitted purpose. Now, in order to understand fully the provision and whether it matches the convention, we'll also need to look at Section 20 of the Chemical Weapons Act. So Section 20 of the Act would say something like, Section 19 does not apply to anything done in accordance with the terms of a license granted by the national authority. As we can see here, this is an implementation measure that grants the national authority control over the licensing of the use of Schedule 1 chemicals, and therefore would match in this F1 of our survey template. Once we have analysed all of the relevant legislation, regulations, and other measures for implementation of the CWC in our countries, we would then complete a survey overview. Now, the idea of a survey overview is this is a short document, normally a couple of pages, and it provides a summary of the findings of a legislative survey template. Now, a legislation survey can be quite long, so this is a useful tool so that relevant stakeholders can quickly understand where there are any gaps in their legal frameworks. It's also important to note that it provides a number of clear recommendations for the drafting of potential new legislation or amendments to legislation and regulations in the future. So as you can see the survey overview on screen, we would include the state's name and also the date of the completed survey. This is important because legislative analysis can be a continuous process, and states often, sometimes we would perhaps we would conduct legislative analysis of a state's implementing legislation. And then based on our recommendations, a state may draft legislation. And then we could provide, for example, a follow-up survey to analyze this new piece of legislation and see where it fits in a state's legal framework. We would include laws and regulations included in this survey. So when we conduct a survey, we look at a range of laws, for example, criminal laws, specific laws on chemical weapons, laws on chemical security and chemical safety, export control regulations, things like that. And we'd also include any laws and regulations that was necessary to complete the survey. So if we were aware that there may be some laws or regulations, but for whatever reason we were unable to access them, we would include these so that the person reading the overview would know that they have not been taken account in the survey. The next part of the overview concerns the summary of the survey and also the recommendations. So as you'll see in the left-hand column, there are the 7 categories. In the right-hand column, we would put a number, we would put a summary of the survey and also recommendations. So let's use, for example, the country C. So country C has drafted legislation that's created offences criminalising the use of chemical weapons and also the possession, but it has not criminalised the storage of chemical weapons. We would write in the right-hand column something along those lines that country C, we have found measures that criminalise the use and possession of chemical weapons. However, we have not been able to find measures to criminalise the storage of chemical weapons. Then we would include a clear recommendation that it is recommended that country C criminalises the storage of chemical weapons. Stakeholders could then use this to potentially draft amendments to legislation, maybe amendments to a law on chemical weapons, for example, or perhaps draft new legislation if that was appropriate. So that was just a brief overview of what the template looks like in practice and the legislative analysis process. Now hand back to my colleague Yasmin.
Thank you very much, Thomas. We will now hear from Mr. Bakhtiar Barotov. Bakhtiar, you have the floor.
Thank you, Yasmin. I would like to say thanks to VERTIC team and Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for giving opportunity to participate in this event and share with our experience on legislative analysis related to implementation of CWC in Tajikistan. Next slide, please. As you know, Tajikistan is situated in Central Asia, and Tajikistan signed the Chemical Weapon Convention on 1993 and ratified in 1995. Next slide, please. We recognize that until this time, there was no any actions taken by national authorities to implement all provisions from the CWC in the country. Then we started to work with all civilian activities in the country. We started with the development of National Action Plan for implementing United Nations Security Council Resolution 5040, which is giving us possibility to implement all measures which is taking giving from the CWC and other weapons of mass destructions. So one of the tasks of this national legislation analysis was the CWC provisions were present, and based on the results, the roadmap should be developed to include CWC provision to the national legislation. Next slide, please. So by request of Tajikistan in 2021, VERTIC team provided us a survey template to assess Tajikistan national legislation on implementation of CWC provisions. To answer to the question, national experts on chemical safety and security, as well as experts from VERTIC were involved. In the first view, it was seems that analysis of the huge amount of the legislative documents is difficult, but when we are entering to the process and understand what is the meaning of the questions and what is the measures is required by CWC, then it was easy to work and answer it to the questions. National expert looks through all adopted and available legislative documents in the country and compared with the CWC provisions. The electronic database of national legislation of Tajikistan, called Adlia, was very useful to carry out a survey. So, because it is era of technology and everything is making by digital work. Next slide, please. So when we have finished the survey, we have the following results. The first one is a terminology of chemical weapons and its precursors identified in CWC were not identified in national legislation. There was no any provisions related to chemical weapon or their precursors. Another thing was the regulatory infrastructure not established in systematic approach. So there are a lot of ministries and agencies in the country which are dealing with the chemical materials and their precursors, but they are not controlling or taking actions in a systematic approach. Another thing that licensing and inspection system, that not all chemicals and precursors mentioned in CWC are covered. Some of them are under the inspection and not licensing, but some of them are licensing and not in the inspection system. So another thing that we identify that the control list for export and import covered chemicals and precursors mentioned in CWC, which is one of the good points for our legislation. Next slide, please. Based on the result of legislation, survey working group in Tajikistan is developing roadmap for implementation of CWC provisions. And we thought that the first steps will be developing of the draft of the law on chemical security and safety, which will include all CWC provisions, including chemical weapons and their precursors. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any question, I'm ready to answer.
Thank you very much, Bakhtiyor. That was a very insightful overview of Tajikistan's efforts. It was a pleasure for us to work with you during this process, and I hope what you said will actually resonate with other countries as well, that it might seem a bit of a big task to go through all of the measures, but once you actually see where they come from, it becomes a very manageable task to conduct the legislative analysis. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Yasmin. It was very pleasure to work with you and your team. And I can say that this tool is very useful and very easy to implement for legislation survey. Thank you.
Excellent. We're very happy to hear that. We hope others will use it too. As we said, it's publicly available on our website. And at this stage, I'd like to open the event for any questions that you may have. You can leave them in the chat box. At the moment, I do not see any, but we can take a short moment to see if any questions pop up. I don't see any popping up, but in that case, I would like to say that this was a short but sweet webinar. And I'm sure those of us that are interested in chemical weapons will have a busy week with the CSP meetings happening. But I would just like to say that if there are any questions after we've closed this event to please email us at nim@vertic.org. This could be any questions about the template, but also if your country is interested in working with us on analyzing your legislation or even drafting legislation, please feel free to reach out to us and we would be happy to be in contact with you. If there are then no other questions or comments, then thank you very much for attending and see you next time.